again, everything that I'm interested in is like living in that gray area between right and wrong, between good and bad. And so to me, it's not that the missionary is bad and the photojournalist is bad. It's just that we don't talk enough about their failings. And by not doing that, we're not really being honest about the work that we're looking at, that they have done, whether that be images or, create different social programs to help people struggling in poverty. So I began enacting, Christy, and there's a series of self-portraits that run throughout the project of me. But I'm also just like really engaging in, this history of performance and self-portraiture. And also I really wanted to make sure that people understood that, the truth that I'm trying to reveal is that collision between that fantasy and reality that we talked about earlier.
And welcome to the show, Stacy.
Thanks for having me.
I'm excited to have you on today. I know we had to fight a storm in order to get you here, so I'm excited about having you, and I'm glad you made it. But I've been diving into your work over the last week, and I am just I'm really excited to have you. It was really exciting to look at, and I have tons of questions. But before I do, let's just go ahead and allow you to introduce yourself to the audience. Tell us a little bit about who you are.
As you mentioned, my name's Stacy Kranitz, and I am a full-time photographer. I live in a small town, or I live outside of a small town in rural Tennessee. And I work both as an assignment photographer, a visual photographer for magazines and newspapers. And I also have a fine art career, so I exhibit the work and publish books. And everything kind of falls under or within the documentary tradition.
Okay. Well, I also like to, kind of dive into a little bit about you, because I know work never really ever comes from nowhere. You're just kind of inspired to make a thing, but it kind of comes from like a little bit of our background. So talk to me a little bit about who you were before you found photography.
Well, I grew up in many places, so I think I always felt a bit displaced, and I was always looking for sort of like, a strong lure of place. I started in the South. I was born in Kentucky, and then after that, we moved to Tennessee, which is where my mom is from for many generations back, or her family. And then after that, we moved to California, and then Florida, and then California, and then I went to Oregon, and then
Wow.
I started my adult life, and that was in New York, LA, Louisiana, New York, Louisiana. Fuck, I don't remember after
Wow.
that. So I've lived a lot of places, and I've kind of moved around a lot. I've been in Tennessee now for 6 years.
Oh, wow.
And I think that, the reason why I bring up all that sort of different sort of places that I've lived is because I think it does play like an important role in my work in terms of like looking for a sense of place. Most of the time that I grew up in these different areas, I was living in suburbs, and suburbs sort of lack a sense of place. And so I think I was always kind of looking for that. And I found the places that spoke to me the most were in the South. And so all of my work really does take place in the southern region of the United States. Except for some things.
Well, it's really interesting. Was your family kind of artistic?
No.
Were they kind of, no? How did you find your way there?
Well, let's see. I wasn't thinking that I would be an artist or really interested in the idea of art till much later. I was really interested in documenting things. And so I came
Sure.
to it from more of like a social science perspective and like a journalism perspective, and a research oriented kind of sort of approach. And then once I started working in the documentary tradition, and I didn't necessarily think that photography was the thing that I wanted to do. I really just
Mhm.
had this strong urge to document things. And so I worked with text, I worked with audio, and I went to school to study documentary filmmaking. But in school, I quickly learned that I am not a great fit for uh, being a filmmaker because you have to orchestrate groups of people to sort of like sort of play out your ideas. And I'm not really good at instructing people to do much of anything. And so so I realized, so then I was taking photography courses at the same time, and I realized that it was like a much better fit. I'm a loner. And so it really helped me to be able to like not have to tell other people what to do. I could just do it all myself.
Yeah.
But also the financial aspect, like was a lot more expensive. And you did
Yeah.
need to kind of have more than just one person to work with. And so it wasn't easy to just walk out your door and start making work. And that part of photography really appealed to me.
Did you finish and get your like filmmaking degree?
I got a
And you
degree that was like an individualized study degree, and it was like
okay.
called my nieces in the everyday. But it was basically a dual documentary film and photography degree that I kind of ended up with.
Okay.
I took
That's
the
awesome.
full documentary film program and the full photography program at the school that I was at.
Do you think that like helped you or hurt you? And because sometimes the education can either like launch us or sometimes it can kind of hold us back because it puts us in boxes. And I'm kind of curious, did it help you a lot kind of develop your style?
I don't know that it helped me develop my style. Much of what I was doing in my undergraduate education was very different from the work that I do now. I did a lot of street
Yeah.
photography, and it was only to like the very end that I started working kind of really immersively with subjects. So it was just really just, I feel like that uh, undergraduate experience was really just about me discovering that photography was the right fit for me.
Oh,
And
that's
then
awesome.
in between my undergraduate and graduate degree, I always laugh because I'm so overeducated in photography because I studied it both, studied it from the very beginning. I also did photography classes in high school as well. So I
Oh,
had
wow.
had some experience before I went to get my degrees. But in between my undergraduate degree and my graduate degree, so I left my undergraduate program, and I immediately set out as a freelance photographer for magazines and newspapers. And I try to explain that there was a time when that was a viable career. This was before sort of the media industry kind of imploded in 2008. And so a lot of
Yeah.
people in my program, the photography department, were doing this, and it seemed like a very kind of viable option. And so I I was really eager to have a career that allowed me to do something different every day. And so, like, assignment work really does offer that kind of incredible experience. So, and I still do that to this day. I still hold on tightly to my career as an assignment photographer, even though the industry has declined to such a shell of itself.
What
Um,
what do you think happened? Like I can point it back. You said 2008, and I think iPhone. You know,
Yeah, I
like,
mean,
what do you think
it was like
happened?
an economic crash, but that happened simultaneously with this digital culture, with the
Yeah,
internet being the way that we experience news and media. And so, at first, it was this economic crash, and then all these magazines and newspapers lost money. They didn't have the same operating budgets, and then with the sort of rise in digital technology, they really struggled. They struggled to maintain advertisers. They had to change the model completely, to things like subscription, and it's still something. And then there's like a whole separate issue with the news industry and the daily newspapers, which have taken, I think, even a worse hit than the magazines, which have somehow found their way to have a decent
yeah,
digital presence. So, I mean, watching the decline of the daily newspaper is just a truly heartbreaking thing, because I think that it's such an important social service for any society. And so to see that
yeah,
kind of decline, and then also this idea of fake news, which I've always believed
yeah.
that the news was fake. So to me, that does not at all upset me or shock me. I'm like, why haven't we been having
This is
these
the favorite part of my show right here. Yeah, yeah. I agree. Yeah, no, I'm just kidding.
I really do wonder why we hadn't had that conversation before. It's not the same conversation that I think a lot of people are having about fake
Yeah,
news that I am having with myself.
yeah,
But
yeah, yeah, yeah,
they do overlap, and I think that the news industry has lost a lot of trust, and that has made it really
yeah.
hard for these different corporations that own the media entities to survive.
Yeah, it's almost the social media rewards salaciousness, and so a lot of it is salacious, and it's kind of it's interesting. It's an interesting shift. I remember that shift as well, and I think it's really really fascinating. And I think you were like in the front seat. You were kind of watching it shift, and so like when did you start thinking about fine art for
Um,
yourself? What was it? Was it when you got a graduate degree in it?
it really coincided with that sort of decline. So, I started working. I mean, I started working for a newspaper when I was still getting my undergraduate education. It was these two community newspapers one was called the Chelsea Clinton News, and the other one was called the West Sider. And so it was the Chelsea and Clinton neighborhoods of New York or Manhattan, and then the Upper West Side of Manhattan, which I learned a lot about. I went to like city hall meetings, and I went to community forums and school board meetings, and it was really fun. So that was, let's say, around 2000. And so I think it was like in that period of 2000 to 2008 that I started working as an editorial photographer and became slowly disenfranchised by the
Mhm.
idea of the false idea of objectivity. I began to see these
Yeah,
cycles in the news, and so I would get these stories would repeat like every couple years, and they wouldn't say anything new. They were basically like, "Oh, it's time for us to talk about this again," without any real creativity or a different type of engagement or storytelling. Um, but the real problem for me came. Sorry, my dog is like choking on something. He's been choking on something for 2 hours. Poor
what
guy.
kind of dog do you have?
Uh, Moonshine is like Moonshine, you're not pleased about this. He likes to
Oh,
stay
cute.
hidden. Yeah, I know,
Oh,
buddy. I know. I know.
oh. I hope he's okay. Is it he or she?
He's fine.
He.
So now he's leaving. So uh,
Yeah, I've had enough of this. I'm not a podcast
I
star.
know he doesn't like all the attention. It's too much. He's like, too much.
Yeah, he
Fine.
knows. He knows. Yeah.
No, he wants back up. Anyways, so we've been away from each other for a month, so we've been hanging out a lot.
Oh, that's awesome.
Since only when I'm able to wrestle him away from my neighbor, who is his best friend and
Oh.
primary caretaker. Anyway, so So one of the things that became really apparent to me very early on in my career was that the kind of work that I was doing lacked depth, because they're only going to be able to afford to send you out for a couple of days to do any kind of story, whether it be a very serious story or oftentimes I worked on kind of, my clients were so kooky. I had Elle magazine was one of my main clients. I photographed fashion designers, and then I also photographed these like fancy fashion stores that the fashion designers had created in Beverly Hills. And then, because I was living in LA at the time, and then my favorite client was Guitar World and Revolver magazine. So I photographed a lot of metal bands.
How cool is that?
It's pretty cool.
That's awesome.
Yeah, and I did that for like that really large chunk of time, that sort of early period. And I mean, it was really interesting and wonderful in so many ways. I remember I was like 23 and I got sent to photograph Slayer, and I was like bossing them around, because you kind of have to tell people what to do, in order to get the picture that you need. And
of course.
And there was like this weird dynamic where Carrie King was like mean to me, and then Tom Araya was like extra nice to make up for it, and they were kind of like duking it out. It was very strange and completely exciting. So I did that for a long time, but inevitably I just felt like everything kind of lived on the surface, and I really had this like craving for my work to like not just live on the surface of an idea, but actually live the idea. And so that's when I started really hungering to do my own personal work.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I think that's interesting. Do you think that comes from your documentary filmmaking background, that you wanted to kind of dive into a story in depth, or do you think it was just really just in response to this like surface level photography only? Or do you just like craving a story a little deeper?
I think it's just like a general craving in my life, and in like this world that we live in for intimacy. And I think to me, intimacy is like this really key kind of to like unlocking like a sort of kind of, I mean, I think empathy is a really problematic word, but I would just say like a real sensitivity and understanding. And as I developed stories and learned how to be a better storyteller, I was just more and more drawn to this idea of intimacy and spending more time. Time became a really frustrating thing to me, the limited amount of time that I had. So I realized, with my personal work, I could spend unlimited amounts of time. And so I became more and more drawn to making personal work. And then this other problem was that I was having was with this idea. The magazine's not so much, but I do actually work for a lot of very formal news magazines. But in the newspapers in particular, this idea of objectivity and this idea of, I would get these different kind of ethical rules from each different organization that I was working for, each different media company. And they all felt so unrealistic and so like it was clearly written by someone who had not had any experience in the field making work. And didn't really understand what it was like to tell a story, and didn't really understand the disconnect between an editor sitting in an office and, being in the field and, connecting with actual people who are going through trauma. And so it just began to feel more and more dishonest. But yet I was contractually obligated to follow these rules that just I didn't buy into. I didn't believe, I didn't think actually helped us disseminate truth.
That is fascinating. Number one, I'm glad you brought up that word intimacy. It was like, I usually have a word when I see a body of work and I look at series, and I just kept coming back to that. And I was like, wow, this is very intimate work, like close. It's very close.
Yeah. And it didn't start that way.
I love that. What's that?
It didn't start that way. I think I was very shy at first. But then once I
Oh, wow.
realized how important intimacy was to like, clarifying an idea and sharing an idea, it became this thing that I craved, and it was kind of all I wanted.
It's well, and that's the first thing I noticed. But this other idea of like these ethical rules, would you be willing to share one? I'm kind of curious because that just sounds like a box by which we look at the world. This is our
Yeah.
lens, and I'm curious. Can you, or no? Are you?
No, I mean, I can share like one of the ones that constantly confuses me. Even though I do understand where it's coming from, I just see it as so impractical. Is that, I can't take any gifts, I can't receive anything. So, like, if I'm going to like photograph at a restaurant, even if it's like a review of that restaurant, they don't want me to get a free meal because somehow that would show some sort of bias or could potentially be seen as representing a bias. But in reality, I've come across this situation so many times where I have like jumped into someone's car, a subject's car, and I've been, driving around with them, and I forgot to grab my wallet because I don't usually carry my wallet with my camera bag. And so I end up like starving because we've been out all day. And then the subject is just like, let me buy you some French fries because you're clearly hungry. And I'm like, you cannot, spend $3
I
on French fries.
can't.
It's
Oh
not
wow. Okay.
okay. And they just look at me like I'm fucking insane. It just doesn't make any sense at that level, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like we all like we all want to just help people out, and if it's not
Yeah.
like an issue for us, why does it somehow mean that it is completely like tearing against the integrity of that story?
Yeah, it's. I think there are varying degrees of gifts, and I think French fries is like,
But in the
is
text, they don't really help you kind of navigate some of those like sort of grayer
yeah,
areas, and
yeah,
which
the gray
really
areas.
goes back to like the fundamental thing behind my work is that I am a huge believer in the gray area between these ethical imperatives of right and wrong. That is what my work is about. If you were to ask me to sort of summarize it, that would be the best way that I could. And so I think what is so hard for me is that those regulations, those rules, they are completely inflexible and completely impractical. And in some cases they make really good sense, but as a general rule, they don't.
I think that's interesting. It leads me to one question, and then I have another one after this. So, um, are you a rule follower or a rule breaker?
Mm. I mean,
Because it sounds like you like push the edges a little bit, and I'm curious.
yeah, I guess I am a rule breaker. I think that that's a fair assessment. I think that I I take pleasure in breaking rules. It's probably another fair statement. Yeah.
Well, it's like your work really pushes that edge, and so much so that like it offers another side to a world that we don't want to consider, but I think we need to. And so like I really enjoy your work in that regard. And we're about to look at it, so we're gonna get a little bit of background and all of that. But my next question actually leads to this idea of objectivity, and you said you started to question it, and I'm curious, what do you think about that now? Has it evolved since you started asking that question, and what have you found out about this?
Mm. One of the things
Because I ask this a lot, and I've had this conversation a couple times on this podcast.
oh, that's great.
So
That's really
yeah, I'm
great.
curious. I'm curious what your thoughts are and how that's evolved and where you are today with it.
One of the things that I think is really remarkable to me is that somehow the photograph, we cannot in our brain separate the photograph from its like truth revealing mechanism, its like concept as like delivering of a truth. Even though we know how easy it is to manipulate images, it's still very difficult for us to sort of separate those two things. And so it's like a psychological thing. That's how I see it. And so I'm always trying to find ways to sort of kind of reveal that problem, that failure of our like own brain in the work itself, that we're deluding ourselves into believing that this thing is a truth, even though we absolutely know better. We've all now had enough of a time to try a filter in, Instagram or Snapchat. So we do know that things are so easy to manipulate these days, yet we buy in fully to the idea of the photograph as revealing truth. And so
I think that's interesting.
Yeah. And so that really, for me, is so provocative, this idea that we struggle so much to separate those two things. And I like to just find ways to kind of explore that and examine that, and kind of look at how our past understanding of the image, the documentary image, still kind of permeates our contemporary kind of visual culture, which is very much where it's really hard to know how a photo was made, the truth of that photo. I mean, I shoot digitally and I've shot digitally for a really long time. And I don't even like to have a conversation about film versus digital, because I spent the first 10 years of my career only able to shoot on film. And now every time I move, I have just like the heaviest boxes of negatives that I have to carry everywhere. And that in and of itself is enough of a reason for me to never want to return to film. And I'm like, because it's a thing that people fetishize a lot now, which I think is really like endearing and really sweet. But I'm like, oh, that's because you can afford to fetishize it. Like those of us who only had that as the only option, we just see it. I just see it differently.
Yeah. Well, I actually, because I didn't grow up with means or whatever, I couldn't afford film. So like, it was just not, I couldn't be a photographer until digital came. And then digital actually became the way that I was able to experiment and develop my craft. And so it was the first time I had access. And so like for me, it was like this idea of fetishizing film or digital or whatever. I don't see the lines, I see images, And so
that's unique for every person, right? Like every person has their different kind of things that they're interested in. So some people are more interested in the physicality of the image.
Yeah, 100%.
And I am not. I'm much more interested, not even in the image itself. I'm actually most interested in the experience of making the image, which may sound very illogical, but that is the thing.
No, it doesn't. No. 100% connect with that. Yeah. I think once you evolve past the making of an image and start like realizing what it's actually doing for what this instrument is allowing you access to, it evolves. And I think that's really interesting. Now, I guess my next logical question is, with this idea of objectivity and all that, is how much can you divorce truth from the photographer's perspective, or do you think that's intertwined?
Well, I think it's intertwined, and I think the truth is both of them together. That to me is the truth. I always like the way I try to explain it is that, so like our understanding of a place, like our knowledge of a place that is other, and that could be anywhere that is not familiar to you. We come to know that place through books, through film, through images, through different kinds of depictions, like artistic depictions, even through like reality TV, which I would say is an artistic depiction.
Yeah,
and
totally. Yeah.
And I find that the truth of my experience in that place, when I actually do go to that place, is actually colliding against my fantasy of it, this idea that I have of it from all these different sources. And that is the reality. The reality is the collision of the two. It is not one or the other. And that to me is the most truthful space, because when I'm in a place experiencing it firsthand, my ideas about that place are still directly influencing my experiences there. And so you can't really have one without the other. And so my book really tries to speak to that, to the sort of collision between fantasy and reality. So it's a collision between subjectivity and objectivity that really is what's behind my work and behind what I consider its truth.
I think that is a really insightful perspective, and I think I'm going to noodle on that for a while, which is it's really, really interesting. And I'm always curious to talk to people that actually work as, and I don't like to use this word as a photojournalist per se, but somebody that works with magazines and newspapers and they're trying to tell stories and stuff. And I was always curious if how much that line between the author and the situation, how blurred that was, and if ever that kind of changed the way a photographer over time looked at what they were doing. And it seemed like you were asking that question. And so I just had to know with you. So it seems like you have you've thought about it a lot. So go ahead.
It's such a problem for me, because I feel that what photographers have been doing drugs and sleeping with the subjects in their work since the beginning of the documentary tradition. But because people don't talk about that, there's this illusion that that's not happening. So when I first started making my work, I tried to be really open about those experiences that I was having. And all of that ended up happening was that people started calling me a drug addict and a slut. And I found that so insane, because it wasn't about me trying to sort of reveal failings of my personhood as like a person with an addiction problem. It was just about me trying to be more honest about how this work came to be. And I think that now we're having like a more evolved conversation, and like after people got sort of it out of their system to call me a drug addict and a slut, then they were able to start to see what I was doing. But I don't understand or know why we haven't from the very beginning been honest about the fact that we get into these complicated relationships with the people that we're working with, and that from the very beginning it's a complicated negotiation. And I feel like the more I talk about that, the more genuine my work is. I also, when I talk about this, I think a lot about Let Us Now Praise Famous Men, the E.G. and Evans collaboration, which is like my Bible, because it is the first time it was in the 1940s that I say this more about E.G. than I say about Evans, because Evans' work photographs were pretty straightforward, but E.G.'s text was incredibly self-reflexive. It was very neurotic, and in many ways you hated him for being so honest about some of the things that he was thinking while he was documenting the lives of these poor sharecroppers in Alabama. But yet in the end you come away feeling like you got a much more realistic understanding of the circumstances between not just those people, but the people and the way that their story was told by an outsider.
Yeah. I think that is really powerful. I think what you're saying here, and I've read that kind of criticism that you said you kind of have, but I've had a couple of conversations with people, and one of them was Pietro Motisi. He was telling me why he stopped doing portraits is because he gets really close to his subject matter and he can't separate. And you get empathy when you have real, true empathy. It is a type of intimacy, I think. And he just said, I just couldn't separate from it. It just, And he had to stop, and he kind of changed the way he was working. And I think what you're doing is really interesting. And I'm curious, do you think that that need for depth and kind of going beneath the surface just kind of allowed you to truly be open? Because, you know, if you think about those subject matters, right? Especially what you were just discussing, how can you truly understand somebody if you don't like kind of walk with them for a while? You know what I mean? And so like, and walk with them, like truly walk with them in whatever their life is, you know what I mean? And I think I see you kind of making that leap there. And it's like it's a type of compassion that I think is so rare. It's so rare today, but yet you're willing to go there, and you don't care the price. And or you do, maybe, I don't know, but kind of talk to me about that. Do you feel like it was this need to go beyond the surface and just being truly open to people and places and allowing yourself to go there? Is talk to me a little bit about that. Talk to me about that process, because
Well,
I'm fascinated.
I think that one of the first things that I realized was a real problem. I was like, sitting down, trying to identify what I was not feeling good about in the work that I was making. And like I said, I felt like it lived on the surface of the idea, and it didn't actually live the idea. And one of the things that I realized was the most sort of detrimental was the lack of time spent. And I think that we're really encouraged, especially in school, but even beyond school, to, make a project, finish it, and move on to another project. And I
Exactly.
found that really problematic. And so
I
I
agree.
I
Yeah.
refuse end strategies. I just don't have ends to my projects, because I believe that the moment that I do, now I've had to end projects for different reasons, some of them based on like my own safety. And so it's not that I don't end projects, but it's very rare. And when I spend time with subjects, or I, develop a relationship with a subject, I do that over the course of many years, now decades. And so I feel like that time spent does reveal a different kind of truth that feels much more genuine and earnest and intimate, than these the way that some people work, which is to go in for a couple years and create a beginning, middle, and end, and then move on to the next idea.
Yeah, it's one of the reasons I get so frustrated with like the news or what have you. And you get this person for 2 minutes to try to give this really complex idea, and they just never get to do it. And when you're like really kind of exploring a place and people, that you're having a culmination of a life's experience, or a society's impact, or a family's lineage, that takes time. It takes time.
Yeah.
And it's constantly evolving. And so I can imagine that like it'd be really difficult to find the end to something, because it's evolving and changing ever so much. And so it's almost as if what I love about that is that there isn't an approach, but there is. You know, it's this like duality to it, which I really enjoy.
Well,
And so I can't wait to get into it. Go ahead.
I should say that it sounds like there's not much of an approach, but I'm very intentional. I'm very intentional about things that I'm trying to discover and
100%.
see from people. The thing that I try to be really mindful and aware of is that the point of this, the thing that I love the most about it, is being undone by the work itself. So having my ideas about a place be completely turned upside down by those experiences that I have in that place. And so I'm really am going in with a lot of intentionality, maybe more than I think a lot of people might think that I am. I am doing a lot of research, making a lot of notes, but the whole point is that I do all of that with knowing that as soon as I arrive in a place and experience it, all of that is going to unravel and change, and my thinking is going to evolve in ways that I cannot prepare for and I cannot fathom. The other thing that I
Yeah.
think
Well,
is like
that's the
really
gray area
important. Yeah, that's the
you
gray area.
talk about.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's the
Um,
gray area you're talking about. But go ahead. Yeah.
Absolutely. No, absolutely. The other thing that I think is really significant for me is that time that is sort of elapsing while I'm working, over an extended period of time with different people. I'm not just evolving and changing and growing. I'm sorry, they're not just evolving and changing and growing. I also am, and so there becomes a shared sort of history between us that I feel like is there's like an additional bond, an additional layer that may not
Yeah.
actually be in the work itself. Sometimes it is, but I feel like that also kind of creates a very intense intimacy that I think really helps the work.
That's amazing. I think that what you just said right there shows up in your titles
Mm.
for the work.
Huh.
It seems like the title comes after, and
Yes.
uh,
Yeah.
and I was like, yeah, yeah. It's some people already have the title. They're like, but it's. I think I see that evolution in you and in the titles. But we're about to look at that. But I'm kind of curious about some of your influences, and maybe so do. Who is you had mentioned one. You said that was your Bible. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
far as artistic Bible, but who influences you? Is there an artist that comes to mind? People that you look at?
Well, I always think back to like my discovery of photography as an undergraduate, and the sort of I was in New York for school, and I was going to a lot of galleries to see different exhibitions, to museums, and so I these early influences during that period have really, a lot of them have stayed with me. And it was just really random, just sort of what I was given a chance to be exposed to, what was showing at that time. It would have been Jim Goldberg's Raised by Wolves, the work of Nikki Esley on like the different subculture projects that she did, and Nan Golden, the ballad Sexual Dependency, Catherine Opie's self portraits. Also, Carrie Maim's like kitchen series was really influential. So there was like a number of works that were coming out during that period, or had been maybe before them, but were being shown in New York at that time that I was there, that were incredibly influential. And I would say they still stay pretty central to my work, even to this day. Also, Chris Marine's work. I just got to spend some time with Chris in New York, and we did like a speaking engagement together, which was so delightful because he was such an influence on my work. So yeah, those would be some of.
I bet that was cool. Yeah.
It was lovely.
Yeah.
And so those are some of the sort of photographic influences. And then like I was really probably like the first artist that I became really obsessed with was Leni Riefenstahl, which is very problematic. But I think that's why I was so interested in her, because she was like, I really am interested in heroes that are villains and villains that are heroes. And this idea that like what we think is one thing, really isn't at all. And so, like, I think she was like the first artist I latched onto, in part because I went to a bookstore and she had just published her autobiography when I was like maybe 15. And I remember it was a Barnes and Noble, and I went in and I saw the book, and it was so big, and this beautiful picture of her. And then I read on the cover, it says the best filmmaker of all time, like something like that, which many people have considered her. And I was like, oh, I want to know what that is, like what would make the best filmmaker of all time, because at the time I wanted to be a filmmaker. And I bought this autobiography. I believe it was on super sale. And I read about this woman's life, and she was like so incredible and so atrocious. And it was just like go back and forth. And because it was her telling her story, she was like so obsessed with herself. It was like kind of appalling, but also just endearing.
Interesting. Yeah.
And I feel like
Interesting. Yeah.
this
Yeah.
is like a woman that is like feels really real to me in that way. Like she's a lot more complex. She's not just someone who like clearly did good in the world and is telling you all about it. Um, she is easy to love and hate, separately and together. And so that was like a huge inspiration for me. I got familiar with all of her work and her history, and I think I was also kind of like rebelling against my Jewish heritage in some very strange way, in part because I was like separating myself from my family and my sort of interest in religion, and so I somehow used that as a way to sort of, I guess, you know, show that I was showing to my family that I was separating, that I was no longer just
Yeah.
going to abide by this religious moral belief system that was, handed to me, that also was not very successfully played out in my own home. And I guess speaking of that,
Interesting.
yeah, it was really my
No,
childhood.
I'm seeing
Yeah,
the
yeah,
pushing the edges of the boxes of seeing the origin now. Like
yeah.
you have your own, you have your, I see that. It kind of starts there and then you kind of push. Interesting.
Yeah, no, my
That's really
my
interesting.
family, had these sort of like, connections to religion. Not they were moderate connections to Judaism, but I was very confused by those connections because in
Yeah.
my home is very violent. It was not a safe space for me to be in, and I couldn't reconcile how they had this belief system, that was so moralistic and yet couldn't actually function within those morals. And so I think it was definitely around that time that I was trying to sort of like understand. And again, what I was really trying to understand was the gray area between right and wrong, because that my parents weren't living as these role models. They were living in that very murky, fucked up space of, the truth, which is a mix of good and evil. And so Lenny Riefenstahl kind of
That's
represented a lot of those things to me. And so that I think is where that came from. Yeah.
it's fascinating. Well, it actually draws a lot. It makes a lot of sense. Carrie Mae Weems is a really nice. Now it kind of makes sense. You added a little self portraiture in there, and
Mm.
um, that I see you kind of playing with a little bit. And then Nan Golden, of course. I'm like, oh,
Yeah.
I can see that.
Nikki Lee, Catherine
Yeah,
O'Beatty were all doing like this really interesting, like performative work embedded in, other types of work. And I found that like really, really engaging. And it
yeah,
really spoke to me from the very beginning.
yeah. So I think this is a great opportunity to dive in to some of your work, and we'll take a look at it, and we'll get a feel for what it is that you do. And where do you want to start?
Let's start with from the study on Post Pubescent Manhood because it'll lead us into as it was given to me. So I
Okay,
had worked on a series. Can you see it? Is mine not?
go
I
ahead.
am sharing. Is sharing.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, I got
So,
it.
um, I mean, I'm just going to read the sort of very simple sort of description I have of this project, first. I have focused my gaze on a group of young men that I befriended at a dystopian compound in Ohio. I went there searching for displays of violence that function as catharsis so I could validate behavior that might at first glance seem destructive, dissolute, or antisocial. When I first started making personal work, I was very interested in this idea of violence as catharsis. And so I made a series of projects about that. And this was maybe like the third or fourth one. It was the fourth project. So I had started with a project about the last legal days of cockfighting in the United States. And then I did a project on a World War II reenactment where I was played Lenny Riefenstahl. And then I went to Norway and Sweden and Finland to kind of explore the relationship between land violence and Black metal music. And then I had always I'd read about this place called Skatopia when I was in my early 20s. There was an article in this magazine that no longer exists called Big Brother. It was a skateboarding magazine. Anyways, they had done this story about this place and just talked about it as being just like a truly abhorrent, kind of violent, chaotic, dystopian compound. And I was so obsessed with that, but I never really found time to go. And I remember in 2009, after the kind of dramatic economic decline, I wasn't working a lot, and I began to shoot digitally. It was just when I was starting to transition to digital photography, and so it was easier for me to make images without spending a lot of money, and the big expense was just traveling. And so I was like living out of my car. I began living out of my car so that I could cut down on the costs and just, spend time taking pictures. And I did decide finally to go out to this place, and I'm still photographing there to this day. Some of my closest friends I met there. And so we can just kind of look at some of the images from this project. You can kind of get a sense. For me, it was like a really, because I had grown up in a really violent kind of household, I have this like really strange relationship with violence. And I think I just wanted to kind of use the different work I was making about violence to sort of reckon with that. Like, is there a way or a space or a time or a place where violence can be useful, can be cathartic, can be helpful to us? But what I really learned was that this place was so vital to these kids. And in some ways to me, because it was a place where they had no rules and they could behave as poorly as they wanted without many consequences. And in order for them to go back and, many of them being under 18, live in their homes with a lot of rules and regulations and limitations, they really needed a place to go and sort of get out some of their darkness.
It's interesting. It's this idea of violence as catharsis, and it's really, really interesting. I think as boys, we as young men or whatever, I think a lot of times being a boy and being a little violent is kind of how you learn your limits and stuff. Mm-hmm. And I hate calling it violent. It's like roughhousing, just being kind of just doing things like this, like it related so much to me as a child, just being because I grew up around boys, a lot of boys. And if you were to look at us, you would it does look like a type of violence, but it wasn't. And so I'm curious what you found out as you had kind of went here, and I want you to unpack that word dystopia.
I say dystopia because I think in some ways I thought of it as a utopia, but I think that the actual definition of utopia doesn't actually fit the definition of dystopia. Fits like more accurately. But I found it very interesting that it is really in the eye of beholder whether that is a utopia or dystopia.
Yeah. So, if you have no rules, it's utopia to some people,
Exactly.
So,
and I found that
really I'm truly free. Yeah. Exactly.
So that kind of word is actually kind of loaded in a strange way. But one of the first things like I was able to sort of identify is that a lot of the kids that were coming here, so it was like a very, it's a really rural location between like right on the border of Ohio and West Virginia. And a lot of the kids that grew up in that area, poor white working class, and they were sort of extreme sufferers of the opioid epidemic, in the sense that their parents, many of their parents had become severely addicted to opioids, in part because they had these very physically demanding jobs, and they, would get, hurt, and then they would be sort of, these drugs would be pushed on them. We all know that story now. But at the time, it was really just starting to come to light that this was going on. And I think these kids were in a real need to get out some aggression and frustration and hurt that they felt, being the having to like reckon with this problem as young children, having to care for their parents when they overdosed, having to be a parent in some cases to their younger siblings because the parent wasn't really capable at different times. And so it became this really interesting way to sort of understand why people would need to go to a place and sort of let out a lot of that darkness.
Mm. Do you think it's darkness?
I mean, I think we all have a darkness. And so I think that, I can't, I'm very careful not to essentialize a group of people. So when I'm talking about some of these different things, these different aspects of what's going on, I'm really speaking about like a few people that I met that I felt like kind of represented some of the people there. I'm sure that some people really are just genuinely going to party, and then they go home to environments that are really fulfilling and loving and happy. But a lot of the people I met did not have, a good home life, and they were feeling really lost in the world. And this was a place that they could go and get out some of the hurt and the suffering and pain that they felt about that. Yeah.
Or just to avoid it altogether, just escape from it.
Yes. Yeah. All the things that, when you don't really yet have a way of coping with what you're experiencing in your life, one of the first more primal things is, these different kinds of violences. And when I say violence, it was, kind of came out in different forms. So it's all based around skateboarding, this particular place. And so like, to me, skateboarding is like a sport of repeated falling. So to me, that in of itself is very violent. And then the kids would go straight from skateboarding and falling all day into the mosh pit. And so, and that, is also like, people are actively choosing to go and physically push up against other people to the point of causing, physical harm. And they were loving it. They were embracing it in every possible way. And there was something, to me, really beautiful about that. And then, there was also because people were doing a lot of drugs, there was inevitably fighting. Physical altercations were happening quite a bit. And then I think just the drug use is its own form of violence to the body. But that's really depending on the person and what they're using.
Yeah. So talk to me about this place. What was on, you called it a compound. So what was there? Well, so was there like a little skate park?
It is a place because it's still, fully functioning, and I still spend a lot of time there each year making new pictures. So, I mean, it's definitely not a place of the past. So I tend to go a couple of times a year, but the main time when I'm making pictures is during this specific party called the Bull Bash, which happens every year. And for me, it's actually now more of a gathering of just like friends that I've known for like 15 years. And so they're like, I've met a lot of really young kids when they were 15, 16, and 17 who are now, having kids of their own and kind of, finding their way in the world. And it's a chance for me to catch up with them and really, see how they're making their own life, their own path, their own way. But at the place, everyone is partying, barbecuing, enjoying each other's company, listening to music, dancing, moshing to music, lighting fireworks onto people and into the air. And just, in general, having like a really wild time. And I think for a lot of people, who have, kind of jobs where they're not getting paid very well, and they're barely able to make enough money to pay their bills, having a chance to get a weekend off to go and just party really hard and kind of be around other people who are, dealing with the same kinds of difficulties in life, just not having been given a lot of opportunities and really struggling with the few things that they were giving to sort of make a better life for themselves, their children, what have you. I feel like there's something really beautiful and communal about everyone gathering together each year.
That's interesting. So there is it just like a big field, or is it like, is it actually have buildings? Like I saw like a couple of structures, but yeah. Talk to me about the place. I'm trying to get my wits about it,
It's owned by this man named Bruce, who I really struggle to like, but he did create this incredible place. And like anybody, he just is good and evil all wrapped up in one. His son, Brandon, I really adore, and is like a really special human being. And Bruce is also a very special human being, but I think for me, the problem is that he's treated a lot of my friends very poorly, some of these younger boys, and I don't like witnessing that. And so I've never really felt so great about sort of talking about him. But he basically bought this land many years ago, probably 20 years ago, more than 20 years ago. He was a professional skateboarder, and he this is near where he grew up. His mom lives really nearby. She comes to the party every year. She's lovely, just a really, really sweet and supportive, kind mother and grandmother. And he just started building all these different bowls, like cement pool bowls, and then wooden bowls. And I should say, after all these years working on this project, I know so little about skateboarding that it is ridiculous. But anyway, so it's open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, all year. So anyone can just show up at any time. But usually it's just like people live there full time, but they live in like these different sort of shacks that they make or different kinds of structures or out of their car. And there's tends to be some people who are like running from the law or just trying to escape something very difficult from their past, always living there. And if you live there, you work on the farm, they call it the farm, just to kind of like keep up. There's like a lot of maintenance, right, of the place itself. It's built on a massive hill, so physically it's a very demanding place because in order to kind of just like function there, you have to go up and down this insane hill numerous times throughout the day. So it's not an easy place to be, but I think that's part of why it's appealing to a lot of people. So it basically functions as like a skate park that anyone can just go to at any time, and then they throw these sort of different parties throughout the year.
Oh, wow. And you heard about this, and so talk to me about how, like, that title, and it makes it's a really interesting title. And so it's like, it seemed like based on the title, you said it was like a study of, manhood, but the post pubescent. It bring that together for me and help me understand why you titled it the way you did.
Well, I think that at the time when I was going there, I was looking obviously at violence as catharsis, but I was also kind of reckoning with like kind of getting older as a woman and like fetishizing young male bodies. And I just like wanted to kind of lean into that. But even more importantly, I think what was so remarkable for me about this project was that I had been really struggling with this idea of intimacy. And so it was really the first project where I thought a lot about intimacy as like the main sort of guiding principle. And what I did was I started meeting different people at this compound, and I would like literally walk up to them with my notebook and say, "Oh, where do you live?" Because people would come from all over the region. And I would say, "Oh, can I come and visit you where you live?" And, everyone's very friendly there. And so people said, "Sure, no problem." So I remember getting people's addresses and phone numbers, and I started visiting different people that I had met and developing these like very personal relationships. And when I did that, a lot of the kids that I got close to were still living with their parents. They were somewhere between the ages of 17 and 19. And so I would like sleep on their bedroom floor. And I would wake up in the morning and like their parents would like, offer me breakfast. And I would, kind of get a sense from the parents as well as from the children and like hanging out with them and their like larger group of friends, what it was like to kind of grow up and be of this certain age where you were transitioning into a man. And so I felt like the title was kind of really speaking to that, which became this really compelling thing. And that ended up becoming a film where I focused on one specific person. And I sort of really looked at his life, his experiences of like reckoning with his sexuality and with, the things that he wanted for himself in his life and like what the limits were, because we all sort of struggle with different kinds of limitations. And so the film really became about like our relationship and the intimacy of our relationship and like me attempting to make this film where I was trying to sort of get him to sort of reveal what he was going through. And so that title sort of more represented all of the work that I was making under this, that all sort of stemmed from this one place of Skatopia. So, and I'm still close with so many of the kids that, or all of the kids that I went to go and stay with. And they, are a very important part of my life. I just spent some time with Jeremy and my friend Colby. And then Andy is one of my closest friends. So these are all different people that I, was fortunate enough to meet through this experience, through this place. And it is like really probably one of the most meaningful places in my life.
Yeah, I bet they feel the same way.
Oh, I don't know.
So, I don't know. Well, no, about that place. About that place.
Yes, I don't know about me, but yeah, I mean, I think it was a really sort of special place for all of us. We kind of love it and hate it for different reasons at different times.
That hill, yeah.
That hill, yeah.
Yeah. I just, it's really, really interesting. And this is going to be my final question. And then this evolved into another project that you started to do. But this implies that like you discovered something, the title to me, like you discovered something. What did you find?
Oh, I think I was like discovering what it was like to be a young adult, a male. I'm a woman. I grew up sort of like understanding and experiencing a lot of these very sort of different kind of reckoning with self that, women might go through. And so I didn't intend for this to happen, but because this place is so male dominant, it ended up being that I learned a lot about what it was like to grow into being a man just by spending time around these boys. It was just really the timing that I was there and the period of time in their life that really it allowed me to see just how difficult it is to reconcile coming of age for men.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's really powerful. I really enjoyed this one. It reminds me a lot of places I grew up and spending a lot of time with my friends and stuff like that. And so and it, you know, a lot of it is it's very public, but it's also very private. This is part of being a boy and being like in finding a place like this. I think is really interesting. And skate culture was such a big deal. This was what years were you doing this?
I started in 2009, and I still do it to this day. So some of the images in the project were just taken last year.
Yeah.
In June, I go back again for another Urbanaut party.
Skate culture is still alive. I love it.
It is.
I love it.
And I think that's.
I love it.
I know. No, it's really thriving in that sort of more traditional way, not in its more corporate version, which obviously I don't have any like positive or negative thoughts about that. But this is definitely not that version. Because I grew up in Southern California, I'm just very familiar with the other part of skateboarding culture. I mean, I think this is really like more that kind of like primal kind of the sport that certain people are gravitating towards, that again involves repeated falling. Although all sports are really violent. They're very violent.
Yeah, it can be. Yeah, for sure. Especially the rawest form of it, the actual competitive nature of it. Once you stop getting the rules and stuff of it. Yeah, for sure.
Which I think makes it appealing to me. I'm not good on the competition.
Me too. Yeah.
I like the pushing up against each other in, basketball and football.
Neighborhood basketball.
Yeah.
And street football. Yeah, absolutely.
And the sort of
kind of football that's played on a street. Yeah.
Yeah. And the power of like swinging and baseball. There's just a lot of very intense physicality there. But also, I think that this place is not just about skateboarding. It is like a lot of people who go there don't actually skateboard like me, and are a big part of the ecosystem as well.
Yeah, totally agree. And I see it. That's what I see you seeing, is this community that kind of goes to a place, and it's kind of got Lord of the Fly vibes to it a little bit.
Yeah, it really does. And,
but I like that. So it's really, really fun. It's actually really interesting. And but this evolved. And so it evolved, and you took on another project. And we can take a look at that now if you would like.
When I went to work on this project, I realized that I was in this place called Appalachia. It just happens to be in the region of Appalachia. And Appalachia is known as the sort of poster child for poverty, a particular kind of poverty, rural white poverty. And I, at the time, as we've talked about, I was sort of really disenfranchised by this sort of idea of photojournalism and objectivity. And so I was looking to make a body of work that directly critiqued the tradition. And I realized that Appalachia was potentially a really good place to do that, because it was a place that had been harmed by photography. And by that, I mean, there was this announcement of the war on poverty in the 1960s. Our president, Lyndon B. Johnson, announced that he was going to end poverty in America. And he made Appalachia the poster child because he felt like it was a little bit easier for people to like rally around, because it was a white version, and we were also fighting civil rights issues at the same time. And he didn't want to conflate the two, because he wanted them both to stand like an independent chance at being addressed. And so inner city poverty was more of a poverty of color, and Appalachia was really a white poverty. And so he asked the media to come to the region to depict this poverty. And it solidified a lot of like really problematic stereotypes, and like really created a chip on the shoulder of so many people living in the region. And this wasn't the first time this had been done. This had been done in other ways in the region, but this was a very dramatic experience of the media descending on the region. And so it was a place that really had been harmed by photography, had been harmed by the media industry. And those were the things that I had been thinking a lot about. So I didn't know much of anything about Appalachia beyond that. But because I was there working on this project, I decided that I would just start traveling around and trying to get a better sense of what that was. What was Appalachia really? What did it look like? What did this so-called poverty that is so connected to its identity, what does that look like? What is that? And so I just began kind of looking at these sort of like common stereotypes of the place, and like looking at different ways that those stereotypes were challenged within the environment itself, and then kind of playing around with making images that both depicted the stereotype and also defied the stereotype. And so I began this work at the same time around 2009, and this is also an ongoing project and probably my largest body of work. So I'm like in my 14th year of working on it, and it really looks at the failure of like images to properly represent poverty and our inability to solve the problem of poverty. And it also just looks at like the rural working poor and some of the circumstances behind why we couldn't solve the problem of poverty in the region. The story is really about extraction of resources, which is a story that I think is very universal across the world. The Appalachia region had extraordinary amount of coal, which we were using obviously to create energy all over the world. And these very sleazy coal barons came in and stole the land from the people. And then they took all the minerals and resources out and left very little in return. And so that story, it's a story of capitalism. It's like a vital story to our being. And so it felt like a really significant place to make a body of work. And so that's what I've been doing for the last 14 years.
You had an interesting evolution in this one where you kind of took on a persona. And I'm very curious about that. It almost performative in a way. Can you talk to me a little bit about that?
Yeah, we touched on it a little bit. I first learned about Appalachia when I was much younger. The only thing I really knew about it was from this mini series, which was based on a Christian romance novel called Christie, that was written in the 1960s, and it was actually written about Catherine Marshall's mother. Her experience as a missionary. So it's based on a true story. And when I was a kid growing up, they created a mini series of the book. And I remember watching it and being really enamored with this woman, Christy, and her story, because what happens is she's 19. She leaves this kind of affluent neighborhood. And she goes into the mountains in eastern Tennessee to teach the poor mountain children how to read and write and clean themselves and abide by Christian moral values. But what happens is when she arrives there, she becomes completely undone by their way of being and learns that there are many versions of right and wrong. So her idea that she has been taught through Christianity of what is right and what is wrong is actually not the only version of that. And so she has this kind of profound experience, but she also has these two lovers. So it's the doctor and the preacher that she's fighting between. Anyways, it's a really beautiful story, honestly. It holds up very well. So it is the mini series. And I was thinking a lot about the photojournalism, and I felt like the missionary was in many ways like a corollary to the photojournalist. And so I was kind of a contemporary version of the missionary in some ways, where I was going
Interesting
into,
connection.
yeah, I mean, I felt like I was going into
Yeah.
places other that were other, and I was asserting a right and a wrong onto those places through, like morality of capitalism and religion and my own kind of set of like moral beliefs, and or like the moral beliefs of like a liberal bubble, or an educated liberal population. And that was and is, incredibly problematic. And it's not just something that it's something that we continue to do over and over and over again. And I wanted to sort of illustrate that pattern. And so I thought, like, between like connecting to the missionary, who played an essential role in the formation of Appalachia. Missionaries were there from the very beginning. Many of the institutions that they built in the region are still functioning today and do a lot of really good work. So I'm not trying to say that again, everything that I'm interested in is like living in that gray area between right and wrong, between good and bad. And so to me, it's not that the missionary is bad and the photojournalist is bad. It's just that we don't talk enough about their failings. And by not doing that, we're not really being honest about the work that we're looking at, that they have done, whether that be images or, create different social programs to help people struggling in poverty. So I began enacting, Christy, and there's a series of self-portraits that run throughout the project, of me. I'm more of like a contemporary Christy. She's like, in the book, she like just holds hands with her lovers, but I'm a little like, sluttier version of Christy. And so, yeah, so I, but I'm also just like really engaging in, this history of performance and self-portraiture. And also I really wanted to make sure that people understood that, the truth that I'm trying to reveal is that collision between that fantasy and reality that we talked about earlier. And so I'm not just playing me as the, photographer interacting with people in Appalachia, but I'm also performing this fantasy version of myself, this idea of a person who is of this like noble good. And so I think that felt more real than perhaps like a portrait of me with my camera on my shoulder.
It's interesting. Is this image here in the river? Is this you?
Yeah, that's me. That's one of the first pictures that I made of myself in 2012, I believe, or 2011. Yeah, and I never really knew that I was going to keep the self-portraits in the work. I just felt like I wanted to make them. That was like the initial kind of interest, was just to see. I was looking for ways to sort of like reveal my hand, so that I was sort of indicating that I'm trying to be self-aware, that I'm trying to talk about my role as a photographer and manipulating the truth to fit my agenda, whatever that agenda may be. And so I thought, okay, well, maybe these self-portraits will do that, but I wasn't sure. And so that's why I began to make these pictures. They're definitely like constructed, like this is my friend Colby. He's not like a lover that I took up. He's just my friend who I forced into this scenario. It's in his grandmother's laundry room. Nice. Yeah. So like they were all kind of these different scenes that I would take kind of along with the other images. So some of them were more planned, and then some of them were they just kind of happened on the scene because of the situation that I was in. And then there's like a lot of different aspects to this project, but one of the other sort of significant parts is these representations of Daniel Boone. Boone is this great frontiersman. which interestingly enough, he is like very American, but he was actually famous all over Europe too. They had written all these stories about his frontiersmanship, and and so so people knew the tales of what he was doing, going out and conquering the land. But as we know today, he wasn't discovering, like, this is him discovering Kentucky. He's like pointing out to Kentucky, but he did not discover Kentucky. People were already there. Mountaineers were already there, as were, you know, different Native American groups who were hunting, gathering across Kentucky. And so I always try to explain to people, it's not that he, you know, discovers Kentucky. He ushers in capitalism to the region, because he was paid to be a frontiersman and to set up encampments in Kentucky by railroad owners. So they had a lot of money, and they were going to come in and take all those resources, the coal. And so he is really the one that sort of brought in that infrastructure. And if he hadn't, someone else would have. It was inevitable. But it's just so funny that Boone is known for, you know, discovering Appalachia and being this great frontiersman, when really all he did was like bring in capitalism to a region that was kind of living in this like very idyllic way beyond that. They were many like Scotch and Irish peasants who had come to America to find a better life for themselves. And when they got to America, they felt like they were servants once again, because they were. And then they moved into the mountains to find like a life outside of that kind of class system. But then, of course, capitalism followed them there, and they became trapped in this very, very brutal cycle of poverty. And to me, that really is like a way to sum up the story of Appalachia. But
it's an interesting thing, because I remember the tales, learning that in history. You know, you also had the other one. Was it Lewis and Clark? I think was the other one?
I mean, these are very simple. You know, narrative.
I remember his story. Yeah,
we were taught these in school. I mean, this is Boone's daughter being taken by the natives, because inevitably you come into a place that is not your own and you try to own it, you're going to run into trouble, right, with other people who are also trying to claim that space in some way. And so the Shawnee Indians is a very famous like story of, they took the Boone's daughter, and then the Calloway sisters, which was like his like frontier partner. And so, but they were rescued, and they weren't harmed by the Shawnee. The Shawnee, like, they walked a lot and it was kind of miserable, but they weren't treated poorly or anything like that. They were not raped. They were not abused in any way. And I call this chapter exploration, because it's sort of when like the natives and the outsiders mix and things get a little wild. You know, like things start to just really chaotic, because that's how this all works. And so this is like the part of the narrative that I'm telling where things start to get a little bit insane and kind of become a bit undone.
I like the mixture of like, you have like very figurative, like the images of the plants, and then you have like these like maps of the region, or like what look like outlines of maps, very figurative in that way. And then I had read that, you know, this is like you feel like this is a chaotic collection of images that you've been collecting as you, and then you kind of put them together, but they all like kind of speak to a place and a space and a connection. And
you know, I am really trying to point to the tradition of this kind of photography, which I would call like road trip photography. Like, I made a lot of this work out of my car, and to the sort of colonial travel narrative. And I don't think we talk about that enough. We kind of celebrate the road trip tradition with like Robert Frank and Alex Soth, Justine Kurland. You know, there's all these really wonderful artists who have worked in this tradition. but it really is still a part of the colonial apparatus. And so I was really trying to sort of nod to that and say, look, like, as interesting as this all is, like, my perspective on this place, it is an othering, and it is part of a history of othering that, is this all we can offer? Why is this so alluring to us still? And just kind of asking some of those questions. And so that was like one of the things that I was really am trying to do with this work.
And I'm kind of curious to your connection to the place. What draws you here? And I think you kind of alluded to it earlier. Do you feel like it's because in some ways you're trying to understand where you came from, and like what?
No,
like, I'm kind of curious.
I wouldn't say that. I think that what I'm really interested is that I feel like an outsider everywhere I go, because I didn't grow up in one specific place, which I think is more and more common. Like, that's not a strange thing. But it was a strange thing at one time, right? It was very not normal. You would be born and raised, and most of your extended family would all be from this one place, and it really like formed your identity. And I've always felt like this sense of like kind of floating and like lost, because I didn't really have that anchor in my life. And what I became really interested in is that, Appalachian people really have that, but they have a really distinct frustration and distaste for outsiders for a number of very logical and illogical reasons. And I always found that like so fascinating, this idea of like, well, when does an outsider become an insider? And like, what is the dividing line of outsider versus insider? And so I think that was just like a very captivating thing, that there was this kind of like territorialness to this place, and like who is allowed to tell the story of Appalachia has always been a question that has plagued the region. And again, it was just the kinds of stuff that I was thinking about in terms of like my own struggles with documentary tradition. And so that was what really kind of made this place such an ideal place for me to sort of reckon with those issues.
You've been spending 14 years on the project, and you just talked about this idea of outsider versus insider. Do you feel like you're still an outsider in this regard, or do you feel like they've invited you in as an insider?
Well, I love the question because it's such a funny one. I feel very much like an outsider. I just am always going to
I do too.
feel that way. Yeah.
Yeah. Kind of a chip on my shoulder, Yeah. But
yeah. And I don't think anyone would like argue against that. But what's so interesting is that I grew up, I was born in Kentucky, and then I lived in Tennessee for the first 5 years of my life. So I grew up only like an hour from the border of Appalachia, right? But what does that really mean? Like, it means I'm not Appalachian. And so it's like these kinds of things are just like so fascinating to me, these kinds of like, so also one of the things that blows my mind is that, and is also very logical, is that Appalachia is a government constructed concept. So it is an actual mountain range. We have the mountain range. But when we talk about and refer to Appalachia, we're actually talking about 420 counties that are part of 13 states. And so it's a massive chunk of land. And that was, a bunch of white men sat around a table, and they decided which counties were Appalachian and which weren't. And then they funneled money into those counties to try to resolve the issues of poverty. So like, I live in Tennessee, and I live in one of those Appalachian counties. So technically I live in Appalachia, but I'm like at the very foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. I'm still like a bit far from the mountains. I'm in mountains, but I'm not in the Appalachian, like in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains. So it's all just very arbitrary. So you could say that I officially live in Appalachia right now, or you could say that I live near the Appalachian Mountains. It's just also like amazing to me, the way that we can define who we are, where we are, and where we come from. I'm really interested.
Yeah. So are you an insider now?
No, I really don't.
That's where I want to find out. Yeah.
Yeah, I really don't feel like an insider, and I would never like claim to be Appalachian. I always say I live in Appalachia, and then I tell people I was born in Kentucky. But then when people start to ask me about that, I make it really clear that actually I spent most of my like formative years where I like kind of became who I am in Southern California. And so I really feel like my identity, if anything, would be that Southern California, but I don't really like Southern California because I hate traffic. And so it's
That's
not
funny.
really a place that I feel a need to return to ever.
Interesting.
No, I go back.
Well, I can tell you're trying to walk this very sensitive line between that outsider insider perspective, and I think you were doing a really nice job of taking a position that's not judgmental, and it's just practicing this level of openness that is really refreshing. And that the persona Christi that you'd kind of taken on is, I think, an attempt to do that in some ways, and I have to applaud you there. And I see it in your work, and especially the previous one that we looked at. It felt, because it's often, boyhood and manhood is often looked at in a particular way of being kind of violent, why would you do that? But in a lot of ways, I felt like with the last series that we looked at, and in that series, you're blurring that line, but you're doing it in a, I don't know, would you say you're doing it in a caring way? It feels like you are. You're practicing a level of openness that it's just refreshing, and I just have to applaud you there. So I just want to give you that compliment.
Thank you, Patrick.
So,
it's been really nice to talk to you. Thanks
of
for
course. But of course. But the other part is this is probably, it's not my final question, but is how do you see your work taking form? Do you think about it in shows? Do you think about it in books, or do you just kind of make it and then like how do you put it out in the world? What's your approach to that?
Well, I think that, as an artist, I have two opportunities to share the narrative of the work in like a sort of resolved form, because these projects are ongoing. They're just like resolved to that point. And I see those two forms as being the book and the exhibition. And so I take both of those opportunities really seriously, and I keep them in some ways separate, but they also do overlap. And when I'm making a book, I really try to make the work for the book. So I'm not making a book with this like the best of pictures of this project. It's really, I'm looking to service the book as an entity, and create the work that best lives in a book, and have the book be its own art object. I did put out a monograph of this work in 2022, and then the exhibition form of this work, it's up in New York. It's been, I think this is the sixth time I've shown the work over the last decade or so. And it is always evolving and always kind of, shifting. But it is the way that it's displayed is very immersive. So in like a kind of small gallery space, I have over 120 images. So it's like a very overwhelming experience that I want to really throw you deep inside of like my thinking and my processing of this place.
Yeah. It's like you have those two ways of expressing the body of work. And I'm always curious how people think about that. And often, some people are thinking book form because, how do you put 14 years into a gallery space? Sometimes it's limited in space, and it almost has to be a book, and I was just curious how you did that. So with that being said, I just have one final question for you, and it's the one I ask everybody. And I'm kind of curious. There's a lot of people that follow this show that are artists themselves, and they're trying to make their way as artist or maybe even just a photographer in general. Do you have any advice for them?
Well, I guess two things that I think were helpful for me. One is, and this may not be the right fit for everyone, but I like to deconstruct everything I do. So I do something and then I pull it apart and then I go back and do it again and then I pull it apart. And I found that that is really helpful. And just when you think you're finishing a project, you're actually only beginning it. So those are some of the things that I think might be helpful to people working in like the long term. And the other thing would be, okay, that's it, because I forgot what the other thing was.
I think that's great.
It would have been nice to remember, but I don't.
It's all right. Well, it's that idea of not allowing yourself to completely resolve it, especially in the long form. It's like taking a critical eye to your work and then really trying to embody it. So breaking it apart, seeing the holes, then going back in, and then going, breaking it out, and just allowing yourself to go through that cycle. I think that's really interesting.
The other one.
Yeah.
Okay. So we were talking a little bit about rule breaking, and I think that there are a lot of rules in the art world that, we talked a lot about the rules in photojournalism and, sort of deconstructing those. There are a lot of rules in the art world that I find really problematic and unhealthy, and I encourage you to not participate in that system. And the best way that we can do that as individual artists is to change the rules, make them work for us. And as long as we're genuine about what we're doing, the system is something that we do have to reckon with. Like it is this huge kind of institutional sort of cloud looming over us as artists, and you still need to sort of participate in it. But you don't have to participate in it by following its rules. You can participate in it and sort of buck the system in many different ways. And I just encourage people, if they're told like you shouldn't approach a gallery or you shouldn't do this or you shouldn't do that, that's a sign. That's a very bad sign. That's a sign that you are not getting good advice.
Interesting. That's interesting. That is quite a tell. Don't do this, don't do that. And you're like, I'm going to talk to somebody else.
Yeah. It means that they're trying to assert a system that upholds them in a high place. And I think that's really toxic. Yeah.
That's fascinating. And now I can see why criticism just bounces off you. Yeah, no, it does not. You're like, I don't really care. No. But you do, of course you do. But it's interesting that still gives you that you don't lose yourself in the criticism. I think is more appropriate.
No, I don't. I think the criticism is fuel. It's very much fuel. But I just encourage any emerging artists to really follow rules that feel right to them and just be really genuine about the decisions that you make. And they don't have to be the rules that people try to put on how artists should show their work and become an artist. Those rules I really believe exist just to perpetuate a certain hierarchy that is really unhealthy for all of us.
I feel that. I think that's just wonderful advice. Just thank you so much for coming on today. It was a wonderful conversation, and I love. We had one other project that I wanted to dive into, but maybe we will have you on it again in the future. I have this idea for returning champions, and maybe we'll have you back on to talk about that. You have quite a bit of work that you have on your website, so this is a great opportunity. How can people find you and connect with you? Tell us your Instagram and maybe your website.
So everything's really, I try to keep it really simple. Stacy Kranitz for Instagram, stacykranitz.com for my website, and then Stacy at stacykranitz.com if you want to email me.
Perfect.
And that's it.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I loved having you.
Thanks, Patrick. It was really nice. I really appreciate you spending time getting to know my work and talking to me about it.
Of course. Thank you again. And thank you so much for joining us today. And I appreciate you joining us. So if you like content like this, consider liking, sharing, and commenting down below. We have to work with this algorithm. So if you like content like this, please help us in that regard. But also, we also have a patreon.com page too, as well. And if you become a subscriber there with us, we also have special extended versions of our episodes and other things that we offer there to people that decide to be a subscriber with us. And as always, we'll see you next time.